Earlier this month, a panel was held at the Schiff Center for Social Transformation in the Library Building at Concordia University. This panel was titled Homes or Hostility: Understanding Urban Cohabitation for Revolutionary Solutions to the Housing Crisis. The panel was organized by the School of Community and Public Affairs. It featured CUTV contributor and former Metropolis guest Gavin Armitage Ackerman, as well as Faiz Abwani, Lucky Santos, and Mohammed Abdulreza Zadeh. The event was well attended and revolved around this central point: how public discourse can uphold harmful or misguided beliefs perpetuating unease around cohabitation. What follows is a full recording of the panel. Thank you.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for those beautiful introductions. And my name is Anna Krasinski. I'm a professor at the School of Community and Public Affairs. I'm also a community organizer, and I've been involved in social movement organizing for the last 25 years. And I'm very honored to be here facilitating this lovely panel for this great group of students. So thank you very much. And this panel, Homes or Hostility, it's about understanding urban cohabitation for revolutionary solutions to the housing crisis. So we're going to essentially explore the tensions of cohabitation in Montreal's housing crisis, focusing on the marginalization of the homeless community. The panelists are going to discuss how these tensions appear in social discourse, in the built environment, and politics. For example, through the NIMBY movement, anti-homeless architecture, and political inaction that's driven by capitalist interests. Beyond highlighting the complexity of unhoused experiences and the need for compassion, the panel is going to examine the root causes of the crisis and pathways to revolutionary housing justice. So I'm going to introduce the panelists to start out, and then we're going to move into the conversation. After that, we'll have a Q&A and wrap up. We'll be done by 8 p.m. So we're going to start with Lucky. So Lucky Santos has years of experience in Montreal and has developed a deep and meaningful connection with the city's unhoused and underhoused community. Lucky has pursued a bachelor's degree in social work, specializing in Indigenous social work. They're currently part of the Comme Un collective and have volunteered at the Native Women's Shelter of Montreal. Lucky brings an invaluable perspective to the panel, a blend of professional and personal experience with housing insecurity. So Lucky, maybe in a couple of sentences, why is this topic important to you?
Oh, it's already on? Cool, right? Is that working? Hi, sorry. I guess this panel is important for me for the same reasons that was listed, both professional and personal experience. So I'm really happy to be here and to share both my own experience and what has been shared with me as well.
Thanks, Lucky. So next we have Gavin Armitage Ackerman. With years of research and professional experience across the nonprofit sector, urban planning, and federal politics, Gavin brings a multidisciplinary perspective to the conversation. A recent graduate with a master's in urban planning from McGill University, his research has focused on housing policy, urban development, and community-based planning. Gavin is also known for his writing on housing politics and housing commodification, as well as his bold proposals for radical solutions to Canada's housing crisis. What about you, Gavin, in 2 sentences? What motivates you with this topic?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think if I could summarize it all without going into a whole thing, I only got a couple of sentences here, but I kind of view housing as sort of the healthcare of the 21st century is kind of how I view it. In the 20th century, we kind of all came together and said, if it's something that people need and that nobody should be excluded from, and just because they can't afford it, and we can provide it, we should do that. And we came together and we established, a universal healthcare program Through my experience in politics and activism and research, I've kind of come to a very similar conclusion with housing. If people need it and we don't want them to be excluded from it, and we can provide it, then why aren't we doing that? Which is, I think, maybe what we're going to discuss a bit today.
Thank you, Gavin. So next we have Mohammed Abdelriza Zadeh, who's a community researcher and architect specializing in homelessness with a PhD in interdisciplinary studies. With over a decade of experience in participatory design and a proven track record of leading cross-sector collaborations, he bridges policy and local realities to shape sustainable solutions. He has coordinated partnerships for refugee housing initiatives, worked with Indigenous communities, and designed engaging art-based programs. Committed to evidence-based and inclusive strategies, Mohammed focuses on creating equitable, resilient communities through collaborative action. So Mo, what about you?
Hello everyone. I feel that this ongoing crisis is becoming worse and worse, and we should have, I don't know, weekly conversation, share our ideas and experiences together. More than 1/3 of Canadians are at risk of homelessness. Even students are suffering from tuition fee, housing crisis, food insecurity. So how we can have these gatherings and share our pains and also ideas and experiences.
Thank you, Mo. And last but not least, we have Faiz Abouani, who's the founder and director of Brique par Brique, a Montreal nonprofit that's focused on social housing, community development, and anti-gentrification. His work promotes affordable, inclusive housing, especially in Park Extension, one of the city's most diverse yet underfunded neighborhoods. Having studied international development at McGill, followed by 20 years of experience in the community sector, in both private and public real estate, Faiz appreciates the challenges and opportunities that arise from decommodifying the city and making it about people and their communities. Faiz, what about you? What interests you in this topic?
Hi everyone. Well, yeah, it is an interesting issue because it represents a problem that is very difficult to resolve, and I just have an affinity for possible problems. I also have a personal experience of being forced or compelled to move throughout my life for a number of different reasons that led me to understand housing as very much an intersectional issue that has to do with not just income, but also what your place is in a given society. And when I think about and recall the histories of my parents and grandparents and great-grandparents, I see a lot of parallel in their journey and the journeys of people who I see in my neighborhood having struggle setting roots, and I feel like housing is a central component in bringing about a different kind of relationship, with each other in this country, and thinking about the relationship that we have here in this country in relation to other countries in a world that is very, very segregated and unjust.
Thank you, Faiz. So we're going to move on now to the questions. Each of the panelists is invited to sort of speak to each of the questions if they desire. If they don't want to, that's fine, they can pass as well. So we're going to start with the question, what is urban cohabitation? How does it play out in Montreal? And why does it matter? Who would like to start us out?
Sure. So my experience related to urban cohabitation comes back to Milton Park neighborhood. I collaborated with the collective Common There is an organization trying to build connection between different actors related to homelessness in Milton Park. And also my PhD was in collaboration with Command, especially Jonathan Lehrer, who is the director of Command. And what we noticed that if you want to say what is urban cohabitation, so you wake up in the neighborhood and you walk down Milton Park and you see many people on the street and you say, okay, why they are here? What happened to them? Then shop owners want to open their doors and they are worried about they are making less money. Then some people pass by unhoused people and there are some not kind words to them. And at the same time, unhoused people are experiencing those stigmas or uncomfortable situations. And even in Milton Park, it has a long history of co-op housing that many activist groups and are living in that neighborhood, and they know the rights of people to the public space, but they're also worried about their safety and security. And then the other level, you see that SPVM is moving unhoused people from one neighborhood to another neighborhood, and they bring problem for another SPVM person to solve the situation. So I believe that we are living in the city, and so we have lots of interconnections with each other. And while a problem happens, we don't have a good understanding of all the interactions. And the cohabitation is about understanding the whole ecosystem and all these sometimes contradictory intentions or goals that people have, and it's possible to create a win-win situation. For sure, there is a power balance. There are different social groups with different needs. We go to different community groups and we see people talk about the rights of unhoused people, the rights of seniors to the housing, the rights of queer people, and we should understand that all these rights are intersectional, so we need alternative spaces or approaches to understand this. So why does it matter? It's a matter of inclusivity, but in action, and also freedom, and also it's about our well-being.
Thank you. Lucky, did you want to speak to this maybe? The notion of maybe underhousing?
Yeah. Yeah, so I guess in relation to this topic, I think about my own personal experience. I moved here alone from Vancouver when I was 15, so this is 15 years ago, and I would describe my case at that time as underhoused. I technically had a place to go somewhere every night, a shelter, different spaces, none of which were safe for me as a young queer person who used drugs too at the time. And yeah, so basically the definition of underhoused is essentially somebody who may not have absolutely no access to shelter, but who has is precarious shelter, unstable shelter. And I think this is relevant to the idea of cohabitation to me, because not only was I underhoused, but at that time I was also street involved. I was involved in street-based economies. I hung out with people who are underhoused, street youth. So to the neighbors, they did not care, if my stuff was staying somewhere, they didn't care if I was sleeping outside, but I was to them, an unhoused person. I was an issue. Did not belong to that neighborhood in the way that I should have. And I will honestly say that that was 15 years ago, but still I walk around in the world in that way. So I think when we talk about cohabitation issues, it's important too to note that you do not know exactly the whole story of somebody and why they're there, what their situation is. But I mean, who's to say who has a right to exist, where? So yeah, I guess that's kind of how I see my personal experience tie into the urban cohabitation conversation.
Okay, great, thank you. Did either maybe Faiz or Gavin want to jump in, or?
Yeah, well, One of the examples we had been talking about before this was, similarly to what they've both spoken about, just the, just on the exclusion of unhoused people or underhoused people from public spaces, and on the topic of cohabitation, we can really see, even just in the local context in Montreal, how we're like really failing to have like a meaningful conversation about this in public discourse. There was like one example recently that was like really troubling, which was the baby shark scandal. I'm sure that a lot of people heard about this, but if you didn't, it was a scandal where the Complexe des Jardins downtown was playing the baby shark song over and over again basically in a bid to, bother any unhoused person to the point of leaving, which is worrisome for a lot of reasons. One thing that bothers me about that is that's so unbelievably intentional. Like, why did they pick that specific song, trying to find the most annoying thing? Is like really bothersome, instead of just asking the question of like, how come we have unhoused people trying to seek shelter here and find a safe place, and like how could we like assist those people in like trying to find somewhere to go? Instead, they just sat back and thought, what if we just devised a plan to, make somebody's life worse than it needs to be? And this isn't just a one-off case. That specific thing has actually been implemented and used in a variety of cases, like all across North America. But there's other examples throughout Montreal, and I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about this throughout the discussion, but I think in general it's safe to conclude that like as an unhoused or underhoused person living in Montreal, your everyday experience is you're basically being surveyed and excluded at all times. It's a tremendous amount of stress on top of the many barriers that already exist for vulnerable people, which I think is an important thing to consider.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for sharing that example. Faiz, did you have something you wanted to say?
I guess I could add something about cohabitation in the neighborhood where I work in Park Extension. Homelessness is on the rise, but the main issue that we are having to deal with is, I guess, overpopulation or like excessive density. So because people can't really afford to live in the apartments that they live in, they decide to be multiple families in a given unit, or sometimes to live with people that they don't really know all that well, but that are maybe from the same community, which leads to obviously like we're talking about like 5-6 people in studios, or like 8-9 people in 4.5 type of thing. So it leads to in order to prevent tension inside the house, which obviously leads to other problems, it leads to people wanting to go outside. And go outside in the winter is mostly Tim Hortons and McDonald's. But otherwise it's go outside in the street, in the metro, in the park across from the metro, in Athena Park. And a lot of the people who are moving in looking for affordable condos or duplexes, they don't feel secure with that. For whatever reason, they don't feel comfortable seeing a lot of people who don't have a destination, and so that leads to increased demand for police, which creates tension among communities that have very precarious status in Canada and might be afraid of being deported or being controlled one way or the other. So I think that if we were able to promote cohabitation among different classes of residents, the quality of life of everybody would improve. I'm not exactly sure how that can be achieved. It takes a lot of resources. The community groups are already very busy offering services, but that's what I would say about cohabitation in Park X.
Mm-hmm, thank you. This brings us into our next question, I think, this unpacking the stigma that portrays unhoused peoples as villains. So many of you spoke spoke around this topic. Maybe we can sort of focus in on this specifically. Gavin, did you want to talk to us maybe a bit about this "not in my backyard" phenomenon?
Yes, I'd love to. I can't stand these people. Yeah, I'll have to try to keep it short because we got a time limit here. But for anyone who's not aware, "not in my backyard" they call it NIMBY for short. It is essentially just a term that's used to describe, or sometimes actually these people will self-describe as NIMBYs. And it's typically white, upper to upper middle class, suburban homeowners typically, who basically want to oppose any form of development or intervention in their neighborhood. And this oftentimes, I think that the NIMBY movement is basically, in a lot of ways, become almost a stereotype, like in how exclusionary they can be. There's oftentimes the excuse that they'll use of, we want to maintain the character of our neighborhood and whatever that means, kind of coded language, obviously. But that can also just, like, their exclusion can take very extreme forms. Like, I read a story, for example, and this is like kind of self-satire almost, of like they came together to stop it was a social housing development. I believe it was aimed at young, precarious teens and youth. This was in Toronto. It was going to be built on a parking lot, and they all came together and they said, "Not in my backyard. Actually, this parking lot is really important to our community. It's an essential part of the fabric of," just totally ridiculous. Although, as funny as that sounds, like, obviously that takes really, it can be very harmful and oftentimes gets directed at, immigrants, low-income communities, and the unhoused. So, yeah, in terms of like how that relates to cohabitation, oftentimes those NIMBY groups are the ones that are kind of bringing political capital in a way. They organize, they come in, and they will prevent, any attempt at cohabitation or, providing services to vulnerable people who need it.
Mm-hmm. So that brings us into this idea of like, why are some communities more vulnerable and disproportionately impacted by this hostility that's associated with lack of housing? Lucky, did you?
Sure. Yeah, I can talk a little bit about just the communities that I have experience with. I am not Indigenous myself, but as like an Anglophone who is facing housing insecurity, I ended up accessing a lot of resources with Indigenous communities who shared so much for me and with me, basically for Indigenous communities, Jessie Thistle is like a Métis Cree author and professor and researcher who basically wrote that for Indigenous communities we cannot look at homelessness in the same way. It's very similar to actually the Beautiful Land Acknowledgement, but essentially that for Indigenous communities, like, homelessness and a lack of housing is just one example of like generations of displacement, right? So, and displacement, loss of land, but also loss of like disconnection from culture, disconnection from family, disconnection from like the web of relations. So when we were talking about homelessness from like an Indigenous perspective, like that has to be considered, that community aspect, and how there's layers of damage that are done even beyond the idea of just having no home. And for me, when I was like a street youth, I kind of connected to that, because for youth too, in a way, homelessness again is different, because often we are leaving our families. That's how we ended up on the street, right? We are disconnected from our families, we're disconnected from that support system. And again, like Indigenous communities, we create communities on the street, and we create communities wherever we can find them. And then the second the community gets big, people want it, people push you out, or you have access to housing, but you have to go way over there. So I cannot speak to all different communities, but that's one thing that is very, very strong to me, is that for a lot of groups of unhoused people, it's not just a lack of housing, but also that constant, like, people coming in and destroying this family or community that you built despite already having like so many barriers to that. So yeah, I guess that's kind of how I connect that.
Thank you. Maybe Faiz, you might have sort of go on. You mentioned earlier a bit of, you touched on these topics a little bit around what's going on in Park X around these kinds of issues. Maybe you wanted to just expand around this idea of like unhoused people as villains and that dynamic. How does that play out in Park X?
Yeah, I was actually just trying to look for this video, but I can't find it. Also, you wouldn't be able to see it. But there was a lot of drama in the neighborhood last year because they wanted to bring in these bike paths, and there was recently a book written about that green gentrification stuff. And it made me very sad. We had a public conversation that we hosted at our community center, because we do housing. We also have a community center, and I really wanted to get the two groups together, and I was very naive, because it's not two groups. It's very, very, very complicated, unfortunately, and I remember actually during the last election campaign, my buddy ran, and one of the things we wanted to do was piggyback on her campaign and talk about our housing project, and we were doing door to door with her, and we had a bunch of people who were low income people who railed on us about the housing project because they were like, we don't need more poor people here. We don't want ghettos here. And I was like, wait, but that's not what? What are you talking about? This is going to help you. So I feel that, like there was a lot of people who were low-income, diverse people who had big families and they didn't want the bike paths. They were like, no, we need parking. Parking is what we need. So it was tough to like have the bad guys and the good guys, and the vilification is something that is very much internalized sometimes. So yes, we need to bring different classes of people together. Like there's people at TMR that are preventing us from building our projects because it casts a shadow on their neighborhood. Yeah, for sure. That conversation needs to happen. But I think we also need to have a conversation internally to be clear about what we want and why we want it. Rather than just have like vanguards or progressives and social change activists basically, tell low-income diverse people like what they need or what they should have. So it's a travail de longue haleine. It's really it's a deep work, this kind of work, and unfortunately it just isn't as Manichaean as it sounds sometimes. And this NIMBYism thing is ancient. It's like anyway, it's a very old story. Just like another brief example, one of the projects we were looking to develop, it was not possible for us to put in windows on one side because it was stuck to another lot, and on that lot there was a tiny little house. It was a shack, and I tried to find the owner, and the owner is someone who bought the house like decades ago, is himself like very, very like super house poor. And I tried to explain the project. I was like, a lot of people from your community are going to benefit from this. As a person who migrated and understands the struggle of running away from war, you understand that people here, like, they need housing in order to secure themselves, blah, blah, blah. And he was like, no, they should get jobs. I'm holding on to this. My place is worth $10 million now. And I was like, okay, well, so much for solidarity. So it's a tough one.
Yeah, very complicated. These, Mo, maybe you can talk to us a bit about how these harmful beliefs shape the built environment and then reinforce themselves, maybe through this idea of hostile architecture?
Sure, I was thinking of the word stigma, and maybe in our general, social life in the cities, while we meet people for the first time, we have some understanding, and through the time that understanding starts changing, and I believe that that stigma is coming from not meeting people in a safe environment, from my own experience working with unhoused people through 2 years, lots of my understanding started changing, and I also learned a lot from them, and I found that they have already lots of revolutionary ideas that can help the society. Coming back to the role of the architecture and built environment, I believe that the current system that is supporting social segregation or division that we see in the social media is putting us in different boxes, and architecture is the main tool that keep people separate from the other group, and that's the way that different social class are doing their own operation. And
Can you give an example?
yeah, for example, so if I want to meet someone and do a work, I go to a specific place. It can be a university, a workplace, and all of these are related to my social position. We also said in the housing that in some neighborhoods you can see more expensive housing, some neighborhoods less. Maybe in social media is much more easier now that all the algorithms are designed in a way that you just see the things that you like and the other person see the same, so your understanding of the world is just building upon your own worldview instead of understanding the other. Also, the other example is about the history of black neighborhoods in the US, that the government was to used to cut the main resources for them and also not supporting the renovation in the neighborhood. After a while, you see that it doesn't have a good image, and you connect the bad image to the identity. And I feel that also we are living in a society that our focus time or attention span is decreasing, so we don't have enough time to know each other in a deep level. And yeah, and also coming back to the history of architecture, we mostly see that architects are focused on designing places for only one person. And also, I'm just looking at an example of Montreal, that in 60s we had Habitat 67, everybody knows that, but lots of co-op housing and movements has happened, but you rarely see vividly in the history of architecture.
Mm-hmm. So we'll come back to that actually. Did you want to add something? So we can move on to the next question, but quick, short.
Yeah, I was maybe a 30-second
Yeah.
thing, kind of just building off of that. I think another example of this type of stigmatization, has very real spatialized consequences, as wordy academic would put it, I guess. But in my own research, I published research on looking at gentrification and the role of stigmatization in gentrification. And similarly, as with architecture, stigmatization can be really problematic, because when you have these communities like, the NIMBYs or whatever that, develop these really stigmatizing discourses and rhetoric about low-income populations, for example, African American communities in the United States in the 20th century and up until now, that stigmatization pretty much is always the justification and the legitimizer of displacing those people. It's all of that stigmatization that builds over decades and is basically weaponized to say we need to go in there for whatever, economic revitalization, or because these people are, they're problematic and we need to displace them or whatever. So anyways, something to think about.
So beyond this sort of stigma or these cultural elements, there's policy, right? I mean, so why are current housing policies failing to address the housing crisis? I don't know, would one of you want to, do you jump in on that, or? Faiz?
I really want to stand for this because I'm so mad.
Watch out.
Where to begin? There's policies, there's lack of policies, and there's also bureaucracy, which is extremely important.
And capitalism.
Because sometimes we have good policies, but we have really, we have bureaucracies and we have administrative infrastructures and blockages and systems and processes that make the good part of those policies and what they were intended to do almost impossible to put into action, and they create huge amounts of costs to the petitioners, which means that you need tenants' rights organizations and lawyers to get involved, and then those things need to be funded, and they're underfunded. So that's the first thing when it comes to like securing housing for people who have it. Then in my business, the biggest blockage is the planning department. So on the political side, municipally, look, cities don't have power. They don't have money. But what power they do have is being able to set the limits of what you can do and where, what you can build and where and whom. And they really, really, really do not use those powers. They try their best to come up with policies that promote the development of housing projects, but they do it in a way that does not offend developers. I don't know why, I just don't understand, it kills me. And when you want an exception, or when you want some kind of favor, when you want to do a great project, the incredible amount of red tape and the blockages and the loops you have to jump through make it almost impossible for you to do what the developers are able to do, no problem. Park Extension is a good example. You have a neighborhood that is excessively dense, where most people use public transit, so you don't need that much parking space. You have two arteries that are super, super, super busy, where you can easily build up higher. Acadie has 6 lanes, and of course the highway is like, it's a highway. You can build up a tower if you want it there. It wouldn't impact the traffic at all. But for whatever reason, Acadie is limited to three floors. And the logic is that, well, if you build more, you're going to create a shadow on the other side and that side. And at the end of the day, if you really push and you try to understand what is it that's preventing the planning department from allowing us to build a housing project here, it's simple. They don't want more people, and they certainly don't want more people that aren't going to be paying taxes. They've changed the rules actually. So the policies have changed so that now when you demolish something, you only build 60% on that land. And the reason they give is, well, people are suffocating here. We need more green space. I don't have anything against trees, you know, but I'm just saying.
Yeah, you can set up the tents there. Yep. Anyone else want to go on to this? And Gavin?
Yeah, sure. I mean, some of what you said resonated. I've also, I've worked in social housing development before, and similar problems, and I did a lot of activism and work in politics, and so a lot of what you're saying resonates a lot. Like, there's a lot of bureaucracy, and one of the conclusions I took away, in just sort of thinking about why our housing policies may be failing to address the housing crisis, we could go through a lot of specific policies and sort of criticize them and pick them apart, and try to investigate the loopholes they put in. They're often very private developer friendly. For example, the 2020 law that came in, which was sort of touted as a very progressive approach to the housing crisis, which is that for anyone who isn't familiar, it was that you would have 20%, all developers would have to have 20% affordable housing, 20% family housing, and 20% social housing, I think, because they're all kind of defined differently. And in the end, the policy didn't really achieve very much because there was a number of pretty big loopholes. Probably the biggest being that if you were a developer and didn't want to do this, you could just kind of pay a modest fee to the city, and then they'd be like, yeah, you don't have to do that. And so no one did it, And if they did, then oftentimes those units just got bought up by investors anyways, even if they were affordable housing. So that's like one example. Like for sure, part of the problem is that policies are being implemented with this very like marketized understanding of housing, right? Which is just very like, let's try to limit how much we offend developers. You know, housing should be for making profit, and we need to incentivize private developers. You know, it's supposed to be this win-win kind of scenario. We help developers make lots of money, and they'll fix the housing crisis. I mean, how well would you say that's going? Not really that well. Maybe they should rethink their strategy a little bit. That's just my personal recommendation. So yeah, I mean, without going on too much longer, I would say a lot of this just points to, you know, just a dramatic need to rethink how we frame discussions about housing, and maybe also just reframe our political approach. Maybe a step-by-step market and sort of like policy tweak approach isn't working. We may need to think about, you know, a little bit more, you know, let's call it extra parliamentary organizing, like, you know, people in communities coming together and trying to find solutions. So, yeah.
Well, that segues perfectly into our last question around, you know, how does the concept of housing as a right challenge these market-driven approaches and advance revolutionary visions of housing justice? So these policies are problematic. What can we do about it?
As you pointed that, so the core problem is about our current political economic system, capitalism. And if you read the book, 17 Contradictions of Homelessness, the first sentence is this, that is saying that capitalism loves crisis, and the crisis helps capitalism to move money from one sector to another sector and accelerate the turnover. That's beyond our capacity and we cannot change it. But what we are experiencing at Common and Telachwag Atelier, and also in Milton Park context, that how we can redefine the meaning of democracy for ourselves and bring it to the neighborhood ground floor. And also many politicians are also waiting for ideas from ground floor, especially city of Montreal, what we notice, and they are also confused what to do. And I feel that having a direct democracy, that having some social hubs in the neighborhood, that people can come together, share their stories, unpack all those closed doors and put their ideas and also needs together, and through collaboration with academics, lawyers, make new policies and ask politicians to change. And we have a very good examples of this is Milton Park Co-op housing, that at that time Government of Canada, politicians, banks, Ford Foundation, University of Montreal were supporting a big urban development in Milton Park. And they also built 2 apartments, and neighbors saw that a 1-bedroom apartment is 3 times higher than the old ones. And neighbors came together, they asked help from lawyers in McGill University, even architecture students from McGill University helped them. It was an 8-10-year war with all these people in the power, but at the end they could make it happen. So I believe that making that alternative.
And what is, how many social housing units are there in there?
I cannot remember, but it's
a lot.
Yeah, it's a lot.
Like 100?
Yeah. It's
more?
Yeah, that's one of the biggest co-op housing in North America.
Maybe just, can someone just, maybe, I don't know about how much people know about what actually social housing is. Maybe we can just explain what that is, the 3 forms.
Don't want to hog the mic too much. Oh, is it me?
Go for it.
Okay. Yeah. How could I describe social housing very quickly? Social housing, just in general, refers to like a variety of, we'll call it decommodified housing. So oftentimes this can be state-owned housing, like, you know, our kind of common conception of public housing. It's not exclusively state-owned housing though. In the case of the Milton Park Cooperative, my understanding that this is actually a community land trust. And I think the biggest community land trust in Canada, if I'm not mistaken. It's not state-owned, it's basically an independent, organization which owns a bunch of land on behalf of the community, independent of the government. They receive funding and that type of stuff. But this is an example of, non-state owned, technically, social housing. So, kind of when I was talking earlier about maybe like trying to find more community-led solutions to the housing crisis, I mean, this is a really good example of people coming together to, basically do something that the government wasn't itself willing to do, which was to, buy a bunch of this land, to take the land off the market. In terms of challenging sort of, market-driven approaches, I think that, in my opinion, a lot of the most successful examples of addressing the housing crisis and achieving housing justice tend to be examples like this. It's people, on the one hand, it's sort of a grassroots, people-powered approach, but really, I think it's fundamentally getting to, the fundamental problem of our housing system, which is, demarketizing it, getting rid of that barrier to entry with housing that says that, this is for profit, and we're basically going to put a barrier up that says, you basically need to have enough money and be willing to pay enough, even if it's an exorbitant amount. The cities and the policies that succeed are the ones that are able to successfully, decommodify land and housing, in my opinion.
I don't know, Faiz, did you want to, I'll let you finish your text message. Maybe Lucky can...
No, I can do it.
Yeah, oh, you can do it at the same time, as a multitasker.
So I'm not texting, sorry. I'm asking ChatGPT about the book because I can't remember the title of the book. But anyway, there's a recent book written about Milton Park. I won't say don't read it, but there was a book written about Milton Park a while back, and it is fantastic. It really shows the complexity of a win, because you had a philanthropist, Phyllis Lambert, who got involved. You had the CMHC, which at the time was still pretty involved in financing housing projects. It had already kind of like gotten out of it because the government used to be involved. The government used to directly invest and operate housing projects. That's what social housing is. But then it became more like community housing, so that's basically like outsourcing housing projects to groups like Brick or whatever. But anyway, so that first book is really good because you realize that, yeah, you need mobilization. It's so important. But you also need money. And there's different ways of getting that money, and historically, it's not always the same way. And I'm fascinated by this right now because I'm really trying to find a way to develop without the government, not because I don't like government, although I don't like government, but because the money's just not there. And you know what? That government pie, sometimes it's big, sometimes it's small. It's small, it's smaller and smaller and smaller, obviously. Sometimes you have spikes, with the National Housing Strategy, there was a bit of a positive spike. But at the end of the day, if you win against another worthwhile project. You're not adding units. So I really want to get the hell out of there. And so that's why I was fascinated by that.
So what do you guys, how do you guys find money?
Yeah, exactly. So getting to that, this is the sales pitch coming. Ready, folks. It's not a new thing. There's been communities that have been pooling resources for ages, and they always use different methods. There's a group in Jackson, Mississippi that issues the equivalent of what we do for our community land trust that they're doing. There's in Oakland, there's a group called the East Bay Permanent Real Estate Cooperative, and then there's more and more in Canada now. There's an Ottawa Community Land Trust. There's a Kensington Market Community Land Trust that are using the same tool, which is the community bond. And I'm not trying to sell the community bond per se. We are using that as a tool. There's a million different ways of pooling resources. But the point is that we do need to pool resources. We need to be involved, obviously, in our municipal elections and to change policy. We need to be involved, obviously, like provincially and federally, but especially municipally, because the turnout rate is 40%. And the average voting rate age is like 50, 55 years. So young people are not voting municipally, yet the municipality has immense amounts of power. So we need to mobilize on the official channels, but we also need to mobilize ourselves. And that means pooling our resources, because we have, you know, when we have jobs and we put money in retirement savings plans, when our parents are saving money for us for our heritage or inheritance, they're putting those monies in various investment products and packages, and those pools of money are financing the very developers and the very you know, corporations that we're fighting. So we should be taking our money, the money of our families and the monies of our communities, and putting them in projects that are worthwhile and that are offering alternatives to the financial infrastructure. Because we talk about housing, but what is housing? Housing is a human right that has been commodified. And by being turned into a commodity, it is basically turned into a financial asset for the people who own it, and a trap for the people who live in it, for the tenants. So we need to think about housing not just as bricks and mortar. We need to think about it as pools of cash. We need to think about, is our pool of cash in this thing that we're not for? Where is our pool of cash? So we're offering a solution. We've built a couple of projects by issuing these community bonds. We pool the money, we put it down as a down payment. The bank's like, where the hell is you, this is crazy. And I'm like, just give me the loan. And that's how we're making it work. And we're paying people back every year. We pay people back, and we pay a little interest too, because we don't want you to be losing, you know, either. So that's the thing, you know. It's just about community finance. That's our solution.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, thank you. Lucky, did you have something maybe you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I do actually. I would just love to pull it back to the personal, in case anybody here thinks that housing isn't the answer to homelessness. But basically, like, I was reflecting today, and I realized I was looking at my exit from the streets, and what happened is me and 6 of my closest friends were able to rent a bachelor apartment for $500 in NDG. The landlord didn't. I didn't sign a lease. It was super sketchy, but we were able to access that housing. It was in the neighborhood where where the clinic that I was going to for health stuff. I was there with my people, so I wasn't pulled out. We were all there together. It was still under housing, but we had a little bit more security together. And I would look back today, and everybody that lived with me in that apartment, we're all sober today, we're all alive. When I look at all my friends who did not get an apartment at that time, they were literally all dead. I am 31 years old. So I just, just to back up what Faiz and Gavin are saying, this is life or death, and it was not always the way it is right now in Montreal. For a really long time, we had it much better than other places. There were still downsides. That apartment was sketchy as hell. I'm not trying to say what they're proposing is better, but I don't know what is happening right now. Yeah, it's life or death for a lot of people. So I'm glad people are thinking of strategies, but they really don't have to be that big. Just give people fucking housing that they can afford.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, thank you. So that brings us to the end of our discussion. So yeah, that was really amazing. So we're going to open it up for questions, and then we'll come back after to hear maybe a wrap-up also from our panelists. So I'm going to take 3 questions from the audience, and then I'll invite whoever wants to respond on the panel. If you have a question for a specific person, don't hesitate. Is it my mic that needs to travel? Yes? Okay. So I can do it. Yeah. So who has a question?
Thank you very much. That was super interesting. The question would be for Faiz, I think. I've heard of a development I'm assuming, social housing of sorts in Outremont. You must know about it. It's not far from the UHSC, I think, and I had an opportunity to visit one of the units. It's amazing, and I just want to know like how it came about and if you know anything about it.
I'm just going to take 3 questions, and then we're going to come back. You had a question? Can you pass this on?
Yeah, this might be a little bit of a technical question and maybe a little bit of a long one, but I was just wondering if anybody had any information on the Housing Accelerator Fund and if there was any like review or like critique that you guys had of that, because I know that's one of like the policy infrastructures that the federal government has for municipalities. So I was just wondering what that's going to look like given that we're in the political era where things might change. So that's all I had.
We have one other question here. I see you will go on a second round, okay?
Hi there. I just want to say thank you for your time and your intellect. It's really much appreciated. I kind of have 2 questions, but I can ask one of them and so my first question is, you know, we were talking about you know, the housing crisis, but also what seems to kind of go hand in hand with the housing crisis is third spaces for the density, places for flourishing and connection. What are some efforts in response to some of those third spaces? What are some of your thoughts as to how housing and third spaces go hand in hand with mental health and well-being and community building? So that was one of my first questions. And one of my second questions is, you know, I'm very much interested in kind of the intersection of intimate partner violence and the housing crisis, and I was wondering if any of you folks had any comments or wanted to talk a little bit about that and your thoughts on the city's action/inaction on that subject.
Wow, great questions. So, who would like to pass sur la balle? Oops. Faiz? Faiz, go for it.
I can speak to a couple of things. So for the co-op in Outremont, there's definitely projects that are you know, on the go. We have an old system that is broken and not responding to the needs, but it's still operational. So in the specific case of the UDM, it was a concession that the university had to make because they were given an immense piece of land, of public land, for free to develop their science center. And so, you know, as a response, the initial plan was to have a big campus there and student housing. But for whatever, once they owned the land, then they were like, oh, you know what, we're looking at the numbers, it's not working out, so we're going to sell some of it to private developers. And so they were permitted to do that in exchange for giving one piece of land to a group of people who wanted to start a co-op. Unfortunately, co-ops are self-selecting, so we weren't able to earmark any space for people who were on the wait list for social housing. Co-ops and social housing are a little bit different. It's a great project. Doesn't really impact our neighborhood in a positive way. But it's, you know, we'll take whatever we can get. So I'd like to talk about third spaces maybe after someone comments, because there's pros and cons, and it depends on what the third space is and its vocation. But like, we're all for community spaces, like 100%. We need that. But I just wanted to very briefly say something about domestic violence and intimate partner violence and that kind of thing. We, in Park Extension, we have a serious problem there. And the information gets kind of like bungled, if you will, because it is a very diverse neighborhood, and I think that in the media, like people don't want to talk about it because the way that it's portrayed in the media is people are bringing their nefarious cultures, which are sexist and whatever. Not to say that various communities in our neighborhood don't have issues in around patriarchy, but the discourse is very much a colonial one. That being said, I would say that we do have a serious problem, and the reason for that is because people are forced to stay in homes because they don't have alternatives. They can't find other affordable housing in the communities where they have their support network, where they're close to their children's schools, where they have their community services and their temples and churches and mosques. So, especially for Park Extension, South Asian people, a lot of them have never left the neighborhood, So it's just not an option to go to Chateauguay and find an apartment by the highway. It just is not an option. So they stay in the homes where there's trouble. The other thing is sometimes there's different families living together, and that definitely causes tension between the families because a lot of times it's not possible to enforce gender segregation. And so because of that, there's suspicions and dynamics that otherwise wouldn't have occurred. So I would say that housing is definitely responsible. Like look what happened in COVID. Domestic violence went up because people were forced to stay home. So when people are cooped up, it does happen.
Can I jump in on that intimate partner violence one too? That I really like Faiz's take on that was really interesting, and again goes to show that when we talk about homelessness, different communities have different experiences. Because to me or for youth, a lot of times that's why you're leaving, that's what you're fleeing. But again, it's two different situations. It's one to all of a sudden be living out on the street because of that, but then it's another one to be have kids. None of these solutions are good, right? Unless it is being able to, actually go into a situation that isn't either homelessness or underhoused. And again too with the crowding, that was another thing I wanted to add. I didn't mention it when I described underhousing, but overcrowding is that as well. And of course, and that's when I look back to, again, my situation, my apartment, my overcrowded apartment, the reason why that worked is because those were the people I trusted. Can you imagine being forced into that situation with people that you don't trust? Of course, if it's not intimate partner violence, there's often going to be at least some form. So again, that's a great question, and I think it plays out differently for different communities. But again, housing, safe housing, it's a good answer.
Mm-hmm. Did anyone else have something to say on the partner violence? Because I might have something to add to that. No? So there's a project recently, actually, that was just launched. I won't say which neighborhood, just for safety reasons, but in the building, it's a huge building that's been built, and there's in there you have la deuxième étape, so you have a space for people who are, it's women and children who've gone through the shelter after having left their partners. And so they go into a deuxième étape, so with their kids into an apartment, and for a short amount of time. And there's also on the other floor, there's actually permanent housing for these single mothers as well. And the apartments are just beautiful. They're so beautiful, huge windows, really great space for them. And it's a non-profit organization, so it's like the OSBL version of social housing. So it's a board of directors that runs it. So it's not cooperative housing, but it's one of the forms of social housing. And so these kinds of projects do exist. It's housing organizations that fight for these projects, that actually work to get these projects developed. So it's mobilization from the grassroots, So I just wanted to mention that as one of the options as well. Did anyone else have anything to say about the other questions that were asked before we, go ahead, Mo.
I just wanted to add to the question about heritage space. So there are lots of ideas how to make the theater space, but recently what we noticed at Common and Intellectual Atelier, that the kind of theater space that unhoused people, especially indigenous people, they themselves created. Last year, Chato, the director of Intellectual, just took a key of an empty space in the basement of a church at Rachel and Pepino. And after 3 months, he created a really warm space at first for people on the street that they were welcome to come there, have coffee, make art. They are making amazing artworks, and they also could get paid through those artworks. And through the time that the space was also open to other social groups. And I feel that this fact that people who are marginalized or kicked out of the political economic box have lots of kind of creative ideas how to build those alternative spaces. And through these experiences, we noticed other community organizations started reaching out to Common and Intellectual that we need something like this in Milton Park that was already there, but at that time they didn't understand the value of that space. And we started putting resources from different organizations, Open Door, May Gallery, Play Medio, Eco, Architects Without Border, and Archives to create that theater space. We call it Milton Park Art Hive, and we noticed that using art as a way to connect different social groups can be very important because it has the healing aspect, it removes all the stigmas about unhoused people, they're real artists, they are showing all the invisible things in the society that we don't understand. It's also an alternative economy in a natural way that's part of their culture. And it looks like a very revolutionary but small scale idea that can grow organically.
Thank you, Mo. So I'll open it up again to questions. So I had a question here, and then I'm going to go to the back. Oh, no. Oh. Yeah, there wasn't, they didn't answer.
Oh yeah, I can speak to it really. I can speak to it briefly, if that's okay. Sorry, I'm stealing your thunder here. Yeah, just in response to the Housing Accelerator Fund, it's been a while since I actually read the specifics of that plan, so I can't speak to that specific, the internals of that specific policy. But what I can say is that I think, the Housing Accelerator Fund is premised on the idea of, is premised on supply side solutions to the housing crisis, which is interesting because, don't get me wrong, we need houses to be built for people to live in, absolutely. And we have a growing population in the country, and we want to make sure that everybody has secure and safe and reliable housing. The problem, though, is that not all housing is created equally. Like in Canada, we, technically speaking, part of the problem with our housing system is not that we don't have enough houses. Like, we actually have significantly more empty homes than we do homeless people in this country, right? Like, it's not like the lack of homes necessarily that is the problem, right? It's the barrier to accessing those homes. So while definitely having us helping expand supply or whatever, and the federal government funding that's great in certain ways, but I think where really the housing crisis is being felt is actually on the lower end of the market, right? And what we need to do is really expand social housing and low income opportunities for housing, because otherwise you're just basically continuing to add housing that nobody actually can afford or wants. Like, it doesn't help that 90% literally of all the housing that gets built in the city of Vancouver is condos, which when you actually poll people, nobody wants to live in a condo. Like, no one wants to live in that, and they're really expensive. So anyways, food for thought.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for all that you shared. My question is, there's a lot of people that really care and want to help those who are homeless, but they never know what to do. So how can people be like mobilized? I know that you have like this fund that people can invest in, and then that builds housing. But what are some other things that anybody can do to help?
Mm-hmm. Okay, I'm going to get the mic.
Thank you for this conversation. With my own experience a few years back with homelessness, one of the biggest barriers I recall, if it wasn't money, it was the fact that we had a dog. And this dog came with us across the country when we were homeless, so certainly wasn't going anywhere. So do you have any comments about the scarcity of apartments available that accept pets?
Mm-hmm. Excellent question. So there was some questions back here, I think, eh? Who had their hand up?
Hi, I was just wondering if there were any historical golden ages in housing that we can learn from. Thank you.
I'm going to come back later for the next round. Okay, so while I'm walking back up, go for it up there.
I really wanted to jump in, so I didn't look. If someone has an eager thing?
Go for it.
What I was really eager to respond to is there are people who want to help, but they don't know what to do. And having worked in this world, trying to change the world for so long, I have tried a lot of different things and failed at a lot of different things. And every time I have failed, I've had to face myself. And every time I face myself, I had to ask, why am I doing this? And many times I had to accept that part of the reason why I was trying to help other people was because I was trying to fill some kind of void inside of myself. Anybody, at this point I'm too far in, I can't quit, you know? But I would suggest that anybody who wants to get into the art, the business, and the practice of being a support person for other people is first to really try to understand where is this coming from. Because if you try to give from a place of emptiness, you're going to hurt yourself and you're going to hurt those people. It's so important to give from a place of fullness. You want to help other people? Fill your cup. Fill your cup until you are bursting with energy. That's the most important thing. I'm glad I'm getting to say this. Yeah. I need a vacation. So I can't speak to pets, but you know, the sad thing about pets is it's a super classist problem. Because the second you can own property, you don't have this problem. So my heart goes out to pet owners, even though I'm allergic. And the golden age. I'm going to have to think about that because I like thinking about it. I want to think about it. I want to dream about that.
Sounds good. Did somebody else like you do? Did you want to?
Yeah, just really briefly, I wanted to jump on what you were saying about how people can get involved and kind of give some of my own feedback. I'm only 28, so you know, I mean, I am losing my hair. I'm kind of an old head, but not quite there. But I had quite a bit of experience in activism and politics, and I've been a lifelong socialist. That's been something that's been, really close to my heart and important to me, which was always very difficult as somebody who wanted to get involved in politics and help other people. Because for me in professional politics, there was never really a home for people with my political beliefs. And I got I felt very disenchanted and, locked out of the political process. I was doing a lot of activism and working on campaigns, but I felt like like I just really want to help people, and I'm just not being given the opportunity. And so I let that get to me for a very long time, and I really pulled back from being involved in activism and politics in like my mid-20s. But what I would say, if you were like, a young person who really wants to be involved and has progressive beliefs and has these values you really care about, there's a lot of different ways you can get involved, but my advice to you is that you have to be prepared to, for lack of a better term, be a loser. You need to be prepared to, we're talking about radical solutions, right? You're pushing for things that are outside the mainstream, and you're really kind of fighting almost for policy concessions rather than policy wins, right? These aren't the mainstream things. So you have to make sure you don't let it get to you, and that you just keep your nose to the grindstone and don't let that dissuade you and give it to despair, because we need people to stand up for what they know is right and help get involved in their community. So.
Lucky, would you like to?
Yeah, I'll speak to that one too, and maybe also the pets one. But I think there's a lot of different ways. It really depends. I'm gonna speak as like a intervention worker. But if there are in your neighborhood, if there are unhoused people, I don't know, they're your neighbors. Like, be nice, be friendly. Some people are not gonna be your best friends. Some might. You know what I mean? Some they're, it's obvious, like, they're human beings, but it's pretty wild the way that, you can live in the same area and see these same people pass every day, and they never even make eye contact with you, and that shit is crushing, and again, when I think of like the communities that I'm closest to, like youth, indigenous communities, and I think about that community connection that is so vital to the aspect of, I don't know, being unhoused. There's so much that any random passerby can do by just making somebody feel like they're not in the way. So I mean, I'm also a shy person, so I know that that's hard. But it's not like you have to if there's somebody by where you live, they're your neighbor, treat them well. And then the other thing I would say too is if you want to get involved, like, a lot of times people want to be doing like really like exciting, like frontline, whatever work. There is so much like kind of background, administrative, like tasks that make organizations function, that make activism work. And that could be an amazing way of just dipping your toes in, because you also get to see how these things function. And then, from there, maybe you'll have your amazing idea, and then you can lead that one. But I guess those are the two things that I would say to answer that question. And then with the pets, I have nothing that great to add. I have something funny though that somebody said to me. They were unhoused in Toronto, and they said, in Toronto, people love pets, but they hate people. He was like, everyone would let me in the store there with my dog, but they wouldn't look at me. And he's like, here, everyone will give me a sandwich, but tell me to leave my dog outside. So I don't know, like, I think Montreal is also especially awful, but it is definitely like a class issue. And then I can't help but think back to like, the idea of like all my relations and the idea of like living in a city and how sick it is to like prevent people, from developing relationships with the natural environment, and sometimes the closest thing to that is like a pet cat, So I definitely think that, hey, I know a ton of people who had options to be housed and had a pet and chose not to because they were going to leave behind their family. So I wish I had a good answer, but no, you're right, it's a serious need, and it often, especially here, gets neglected. So I'm sorry that you went through that.
Yeah. I'm going to give you the parole in a sec, but just to mention specifically where you can get involved in your neighborhood, you can check out the housing organization, if there's a housing organization. And you can, if there's no housing organization, then it's a little more complicated, but you can join committees, or you can get on some sort of like get an infolette, which will send you information on activities that are being organized, trainings, demonstrations, activities that are related to housing. And there's also the Le Frappru, which is a coalition, like a Quebec-wide coalition of housing organizations that has many campaigns that they're fighting for social housing, and they're calling. They often you can join, like follow them on Instagram or whatever, and you can get like see when they're calling people to come to demonstrations and things. So FRAPRU, FRAPRU, le Front de Réaménagement et de Réaménagement something or other urbain. I don't know. Mo?
I love the pet question because it unpacks lots of things that are happening in our everyday life and we don't notice. The reality is that there's a book called Theory U that it says that imagine a society that they wake up in the morning and they do something that brings harm to themselves, to the society, and also to the planet, and it's exactly us, that we're doing everyday actions that are bringing harm. And why this is happening? Because we're in a system that wants to make more money as much as possible, and they are using devices that are coordinating our activities, and whatever is different from this clock time, they just neglected, like the nature, like the pets, like the human connections. Everybody now is happy about the remote work, that we are at home, but you're losing all these social connections, and things are becoming worse. And I feel that that's reflection that Faiz was saying, that why we wanna help. Maybe we should even also change the health that we are all suffering. I think that now burnout and stress is becoming something regular, and some people use it as a value. And why we are shouting at microwave to make the food as soon as possible, sometimes you forget your food. And we are talking in the university setting. I mostly give this example that more than 67% of the students in Concordia University have food insecurity issues. More than 70% of the university students in Canada before COVID were suffering social isolation. So let's be real together that there are lots of pain already for us. I'm not saying that why these problems are there, but why nobody talks about it? Why everybody looks happy?
Thank you. Yeah, we only have 1 minute left, so we're not going to really be able to go back to questions. So we'll finish this round and then we'll do the wrap-ups. So Gavin, did you have something you wanted to say?
Yeah, just really briefly. I know we're wrapping up, so I don't have time to kind of go into all of it, but just on the question of sort of golden ages in housing, I think is a really interesting question. There's a bunch of examples that I could speak about at length and would love to, but I don't have time to do that, unfortunately. So I'll give you a list just quickly of some that you could look into if you're interested. The first one I would mention is for sure is Red Vienna, which still has had lasting impacts to this day. This was a period in Vienna in the early 20th century where they built mass social housing and decommodified land, and now to this day, about 2/3 of people, residents in Vienna, live in social housing, and very high standard of living, very affordable. A couple other ones, very briefly, you could look into the Swedish Millions program, which was another 20th century social democratic approach to building social housing, which I think saw pretty modest success. Singapore has a very interesting housing system. I think there are maybe some issues here and there with it, but almost everybody in Singapore lives in state-owned housing, which is interesting. And my last one, sort of an unlikely one, would be Britain before Margaret Thatcher. Because what did she ruin in England? But this was like in the early 20th, kind of post-war, before Thatcher came in, I think between 1/4 and 1/3 of everybody in the United Kingdom lived in social housing. So that's another example you could look into. Unfortunately, no longer exists, but yeah.
And in my neighborhood, there used to be 40% social housing, but in Point St. Charles, now we're down to like probably around 30 because of the condo developments. It's not like there's less social housing, it's just that there's more condo developments. So, that's close to us. Faiz, did you have something you wanted to say about this golden age thing, or did Gavin
I'm waiting for my golden age.
Okay, you're waiting for your golden age. Okay, so let's now move into the wrap up. Thank you for those really amazing questions, and sorry that we didn't have more time for more questions. So now each of our panelists is going to take a minute or two to sort of do their closing remarks on the topic. Is there anybody who feels motivated to start? Mo feels motivated. Go for it.
So I just want to finish with the golden age that I have the image. Actually, it might be a nostalgia, but I'm thinking about my grandmother's carpet workshop. I'm from Iran. Yaz, there is a small desert city in the middle of the country. And so the earth architecture and adab architecture is very famous in that area, and wind catchers and also courtyards. And most of the houses at that time had a carpet workshop. It was a co-working space that mostly ran by women. And so my grandmother used to invite younger women come to that space, help her to make the carpets. Maybe in every 2 months they made one. So what was happening in that space, that it was a space for making money, learning, socializing, talking about what's happening in the neighborhood. Also, my grandmother used to find partners for them. It was a matchmaking space. Yeah. So what happened, after that, big factories came to the city. So now if you want to learn, go to the university. If you want to make money, go to the factory. If you want to socialize, go to the bar, however. And if you want to find partner, go to the Tinder. And so what I'm seeing in this experience, that there was only one space, mix of everything was happening, and the whole system just separated all these activities to make more money out of this. And I feel that now we are losing the meaning of work, and we are not anymore workers, we are just laborers of a system, and the real work should help us to grow in different layers.
Wow, thank you, Mo.
Oh, I basically have very little, but it kind of ties in well to Mo. What Mo said is, I was just gonna say, you know, like, we have to decommodify housing, but we also have to decommodify community. I think that's the only actual way that we will stop going in the direction that we're going now. So, that's what I got.
Yeah, thank you, Lucky.
I guess building off that a bit, I'm going to kind of, thinking of maybe one point that I would want to leave the audience with, that I could think of, and talking about decommodifying and thinking of, we're talking about radical solutions. What does it really mean to be a radical solution? I did my undergrad here at Concordia, and one of my majors was philosophy, so I feel like I'm entitled to drop a little philosophy reference here. But there's a really great writer, Mark Fisher, who you may have read. He's got a really fantastic book that he had written called Capitalist Realism. And he has a great quote where he says, it feels like it could be easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism, right? Which I think is a really interesting way to start a book, because the whole point of that book and a lot of his work is that, oftentimes, we're limited in what we can do by really our own imagination and what we accept as just natural facts, right? We oftentimes place barriers on ourselves in our own discourse and the solutions that are available to us. People will oftentimes ask, it sounds great, but how are you going to pay for it? Oh, that sounds great, but how would you even do that? Besides the fact that we've got a million examples all over the world of successful radical housing alternatives, I would also say that, talking about putting barriers on the way that putting limits on your own imagination, it's like we live in a society that has split the atom and sent human beings to the moon. I completely and utterly reject the idea that somehow we're incapable of building houses and giving them to people. That does not make any sense. We're capable of doing anything that we organize and put our minds to And I think that's one of the things I just would want to leave you with is, you know, don't let anybody, you know, just cast your, you know, progressive ideals to the side because that's just not the mainstream thing, you know. Society and the things that we won were won by losers. They were won by people who lost and nobody believed in what they, you know, were fighting for. The civil rights movement, you know, think about all the people in that and so many other movements that had to lose and go up against such difficult things until they won, and then they became winners, and we remember those people for, you know, expanding their imagination of what is possible and of human rights and justice. So that's my closing statement.
That's very inspiring. Thank you.
That's hard to follow that.
Faiz.
But yeah, so really, thanks everyone for closing it up. It's very inspiring to hear everyone speak here. I'm so glad I got to meet everyone. And I would say if there are people in this room that are looking for a laboratory where they can experiment with solutions to really complex problems and to put into practice their ideals, or if they're looking for a place to, you know, maybe start a small business and find their life partner. Either ways, I think that, you know, our community center at 633 Beaumont Avenue is a great place for you to experiment and to work with us and support us in coming up with solutions and working on projects, whether it be community organizing projects or literally building housing projects. So, you know, you have our info in the documentation, but it's really easy. It's just www.briqueparbrique.com. And yeah, get in touch. We're looking for talent. We want the best.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, our amazing panelists, and also everybody in the room for this really very engaging conversation. So we've explored how cohabitation tensions and the housing crisis show up in our environments, but our key takeaway is the need for revolutionary solutions. So let's leave here with these new insights, but also with a commitment to extend compassion and dignity to everyone who calls this city home. So as Faiz mentioned, if you're interested in learning more, there's a space that's set up at the front with informational pamphlets from local housing organizations. So you can go check that out. And finally, I'd like to invite up to the front the student organizers so that we can thank them all for doing this amazing work. So thank you to Elsie, Eve, John, Martin, Sarah Luz, and Sean for organizing this amazing event. Great work, everybody. We're like 10 minutes early.
I just wanted to give a special thanks to Dave Plant Catering for all of the lovely food. He's a friend of the program and a friend of ours, so shout out to Dave.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to the moderator and to all of you panelists. It was really amazing hearing you with your funny, humorous insights, and just the whole conversation with all of your personal details was really amazing to hear. Thank you.
Thank you all again so much. The panelists and the moderator will stay here for a bit. If you guys want to stay connected with them, feel free to talk with them. Yeah, I think that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much,